The modern nation of Spain ultimately gets its name from Hispania, which is the name that the Romans gave to the entire peninsula. As I mentioned in my video about the languages of Spain, all languages still spoken there are descended from Latin, the language of the Romans, that is, with the exception of the Basque language spoken in the northeast. The Romans brought many things to Spain, but it does beg the question, what was Spain like before they arrived? Who were the peoples indigenous to the Iberian Peninsula before the Romans? Well, let's find out. To give a brief overview of Spanish prehistory, there were still Neanderthals living in the Iberian Peninsula around 33,000 BC, although they weren't long for it, and humans had definitely crossed into the peninsula by around 15,000 BC, as we find beautiful rock paintings being painted in caves in the Iberian Peninsula. And by 2500 BC, we have evidence of the Yamnaya culture, a people from Ukraine who are incidentally also the first Indo-European peoples to arrive. But when they arrived, they already found people living there. And by the time of the Iron Age, Spain would be as much influenced by the people who already had made a home there as by groups coming from elsewhere. The name of the Iberians comes from the Greek word Ibides, which itself comes from the Greek word Iberos, which was their name for a river that flowed in the north of Spain, which today is called the River Ebro. Then as today, it formed a major barrier for communication between people, and so a different culture developed on one side of the River Ebro, which is why the Greeks decided to name the cultures they encountered there after this large body of water. The Iberians stretched along a region that is sometimes called the Spanish Levant, an area along the eastern coast of today's Spain, but rather than being one consolidated polity, we might see the Iberians instead as being made up of different tribal groups that sometimes worked together and sometimes fought one another in this coastal region. They operated from oppida or fortified centres along the coast that resembled the cities in the rest of the Mediterranean, some of the largest being Tivissa, Sagunto and Lucentum. The language spoken by the people in these cities is not really very well known to linguists today. It has survived in several inscriptions which were itself based on alphabets brought by peoples like the Phoenicians, and several links to Italian languages, both Indo-European and Etruscan, have been made. Although perhaps the most convincing link is with another pre-Indo-European language, the language of the Basques, as the Iberian numerical system and the Basque numerical system share certain commonalities. What is clear is that great social change happened on this southern and eastern coast of Spain during the 5th and early 4th centuries, at which point there was more social stratification that led to greater urbanization into these centres, possibly based on a clientele system where tradable goods were handed over in exchange for political allegiance, this making them somewhat different to the peoples that lived further inland in the Iberian Peninsula, and was largely driven by trading contacts across the Mediterranean with peoples like the Phoenicians as well as the Greeks. This allowed access for a noble few to luxury goods as well as superior technologies such as advanced metalworking, but also the all-important writing that appears in the Iberian script based on that brought by the newcomers. This led to greater social stratification and explains the need for fortified urban centres with greater organizational control. This is also why the Greeks called the entire peninsula Iberos, as these were the first people they encountered when they hit the eastern coast of Spain, which you would find coming from Greece. Their influence can also clearly be seen in art and sculpture, like the famous Lady of Elche, which likely represents a priestess. While this has clear Hellenistic or Greek influences, the religion and the gods that they worship, like Baal and Melkor, were the Phoenician deities brought over from the Mediterranean. And in this way, the Iberians were far more looking outwards than looking back in at the rest of Spain, which led to a unique blend of cultures. It wasn't just a one-sided transaction, however, and often the very warlike Iberians were prized by both the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and later Carthaginians and Romans, as mercenary soldiers, using the iconically shaped falcatae. which are often shown as being used by the Iberians during their various campaigns fighting either for Greeks or Phoenicians or the Egyptians, and they were especially prized along with slingers from the Balearic Islands and used on Sicily in the various wars that took place there, as well as I said, by Hannibal and other Carthaginian generals when fighting against the Romans. But more about this in my next upload, which will be on the Roman conquest of Hispania, where I will also mention the fate of the Iberians. Phoenicia is a land that was far away from the coasts of Iberia. It lay right the way across the eastern Mediterranean, on the shores of what's now Syria and Lebanon and the Near East. The people there were known to be famous merchants and traders, trading goods and establishing trading outposts and colonies to further their mercantile endeavours. And it's in this capacity that people from Phoenicia also came to what is now Spain. They came in a variety of different places, but largely focused their efforts on the southern coast around the Horn of Gibraltar, as well as further up the coast, although they did also found a city further inland at Corduba. And many of these places are still the largest cities in the south of Spain today, if the names have changed a little bit for modern Spanish. It's thought that the first Phoenician trading colonies and outposts that were built in Iberia were built around 1000 BC, although potentially they came only around 100 years later. It's thought that the name Hispania, the name that the Romans took over to use the entire peninsula, actually might have come from the Punic Ishapam, which meant the coast of Hydraxes. The Phoenicians brought many important technologies to Spain, one of them being ironworking and advanced metalwork, which we already saw was important for the Iberian peoples that they came into contact with. As well as this, they also brought wheel-spun ceramics and plenty of foodstuffs such as olives and wine, which were important and continue to be classic staples of the Spanish countryside today. They also founded the city of Malacca, which is today's Malaga, from another Phoenician colony at Tyre. Now, colonists from Tyre are also famous for founding another city, Kurt Hudust, and this city today is more commonly known as Carthage, as the new city. And it's from Carthage that another group, the Carthaginians, would also come to Spain and would also have a large impact on the people there, eventually driving out the Phoenician commercial interests and replacing it with their own. In fact, the Carthaginians even conquered Spain at one point. Another ancient seafaring people from the eastern Mediterranean first arrived in Iberia around 650 BC. Potentially being blown off course from Egypt, Greek mariners made their way to the Iberian coast and decided to found trading colonies along its shores. They were likely interested in the great amount of luxury metals that were coming out of the peninsula. These were being traded by the Phoenicians, who were active trading rivals of the Greeks, and the Greeks likely also wanted to get involved in this lucrative trade, although how successful they were in this end is not entirely clear. They founded several key sites, the largest being Emporion in the very north of what is now Catalunya, but there were also many other sites that were founded largely in the more eastern coastline of the Spanish Levant to trade with the Iberian peoples there, largely looking at getting their hands on some of the precious metals. Several of these trading sites, like the one at Emporion, have shown us an insight into what these colonies were like. They were part of an extensive trade route that included Massalia, which is today Marseille, in the south of France, that spread across the Mediterranean right the way back to the founder states in Greece. What's interesting is that it appears that Greeks and native Iberians lived side by side. This is judging by the cemeteries at Emporion, where Greek burials have been found next to the cremated remains of the Iberians, which were buried in the same place, which suggests close communication. Another important advancement of the Greeks on the Iberian coast was to bring coinage, something that was not used by the Phoenicians, who simply bartered. This would be the first time that coins would appear in Spain, but certainly not the last. It's fair to say that while the Greeks had an important cultural influence on the Iberians, as we could see from the Hellenistic style of sculpture of the Lady of Elche, they were never as numerous as the Phoenicians were in this area, and the Phoenicians, having of course colonies much closer, were in a more powerful position and were able to shut the Greeks out of the trading lanes up to Britannia and other areas through the Straits of Gibraltar. This particularly became the case when the Carthaginians became the masters, as they too were fighting a trade war against the Greeks. Nevertheless, the Greek contribution shouldn't be forgotten, and it's ultimately from the Greek historians like Herodotus and others that the Romans learnt about the Iberian Peninsula and its riches for the first time. The term Celts gets bandied around a lot without having a proper definition when it's being used a lot of the time. Here it will be taken to mean a group of people who have a shared language, elements of material culture, and sometimes, although more trickily, shared DNA and ancestral heritage as well. Although, as we will see, being a Celt need not be related to coming from a certain ancestral group, as it's thought that many groups who had a different heritage simply switched the language that they spoke and the elements of the material culture that they produced, in which time they became known as Celts to classical scholars like the Greeks and the Romans. The Celts appear to have come into the Spanish Peninsula around 600 BC, or at least that's one of the groups that came into the Iberian Peninsula. There's also another wave of migration in a traditional model that was seen as having come in around 1000 BC, although newer ideas are suggesting actually that it was more a continuous flow rather than spikes of invasion or migration across the Pyrenees. And in fact, more recent theories proposed by Barry Cunliffe about the Atlantic origins of the Celts actually places the Celts as having been originated as a culture close to the Pyrenees, based on a reanalysis of Herodotus where he believed the Danube had come from. And in this way he thinks that the Celts emerged as a people on the Atlantic seaboard that had access to precious metals such as tin and copper and followed along these trade lanes, in which case that would make the Celts almost indigenous to this area of northern Iberia. In any case, they do seem to have come across the north of the Iberian Peninsula and spread out over a large area, although the exact intricacies without written language can be quite hard to ascertain, and it's quite possible that there were pockets of pre-Celtic still speaking a pre-Indo-European language mixed in between them. The Celts were made up of various different tribes and groups across the area that they inhabited, who often fought with one another, with one rising and another falling. An area of particular interest for the study of the Celts in Iberia is the area of modern-day Galicia and Asturias, as this area developed a special kind of culture that became known as the Castro culture. This Castro word coming from another Latin term, castrum, which is used for a fortified centre. And the reason why it became known as the Castro culture is because of the cities that developed in these areas, a kind of hill forts that were made. The idea of the hill fort being that when an enemy attacked, all the people and livestock could enter this hill fort and keep themselves safe. Now, over time these hill forts developed, and some actually became oppida, which were permanently inhabited and growing larger and larger, with buildings and artisans and smithies and things like this being developed in these protected sites, the castra. The number of castra greatly increased in the 6th century, which is one of the reasons for the earlier traditional idea that this had been when the Celts had first migrated into the Iberian Peninsula. Many new hill forts were founded, being larger and more densely populated than the ones who had come before, and new art styles also appeared within them. There was a particular emphasis on individual prowess, and there was a certain level of egalitarianism within these societies, as each person tried to make themselves look as good as they could, showing particular features such as the torques, which are famous from other Celtic sites, as well as brooches and other forms of jewellery. As mentioned, these became more densely populated and became larger, extending over larger areas as polities consolidated, and some became more powerful, drawing in other castra that became subservient to them. Two of the largest examples of these in Galicia are San Tregro and San Cibrao de Las. These were huge castra sites that were inhabited for many centuries amongst the hills there. They were also protected by earthen walls, as well as ditches and ramparts, and sometimes foundations of stone as well. The material culture found within them clearly belongs to the Latin period Celtic culture, and this is why it is often identified as being connected with the larger movement of Celtic peoples in Europe. Rather curiously, another of the finds that is common are of guerreros, which are these statues of warriors that have appeared in these settlements, although their exact meaning is unknown. What's interesting, however, is that in these what appear to be very Celtic areas in the northwest of Spain, there are around 50% of the pre-Roman place names that are non-Celtic, although many of the larger ones are of course descended from the Celts, such as Lugo. What's interesting about this as well is that one can see various Celtic names such as Camulus, Catorus and Celtiates, which often have parallels to other parts of the Celtic world, as names in Gaul and names in Britain show. However, there is a series of them that are also interesting that have the letter P. The reason why this is interesting is because the Iberian Celtic languages from inscriptions are shown to have been a Q Celtic language. That is to say, where there had been a P sound before in the language had become a Qu sound in this form of the Celtic languages, just as is the case in modern Irish and modern Scots Gaelic. This perhaps suggests that the areas where we find names with P's in them were areas where there was indeed mixing with people that were not Celtic, with a pre-Indo-European population that was probably assimilated into the wider Celtic culture. This name may sound a little bit familiar if you've been watching the video all the way through so far, as the Celtiberians are indeed a people that were neither really Celtic nor Iberian, and yet they were both. And it's been hypothesized that there were a people, and indeed the ancient sources, the Greeks, they include and write about a people called the Celtiberians, who they said were a mixture of both the Celts and the Iberians. And again, the Celtiberians can also be split into various different polities, and there is a lot of academic debate about which groups count as Celtiberian and which ones should be counted as Celts. The largest, most powerful and undisputably Celtiberian of these groups, however, was the Arevaki, and they often succeeded in uniting the other Celtiberian tribes through coercion or commerce or shared ancestry to fighting against external threats such as the Romans. They also had some large oppida centres as well as hill forts, some of the largest being Tiermes, Numantia, Botorita and Segeda. And in fact that Segeda, the Seg element, is one of the key elements to finding Celtic place names and is found very frequently throughout the Iberian Peninsula. The Celtiberians as a people, as the Greeks indicated, do appear to have shared a material culture that was similar both to the Celts further in the Spanish hinterland and to the north, as well as the Iberian peoples that they came into contact with. And it's thought that the two should be seen as a kind of fusion between them, that Celtic influence from the one side as well as the Iberian, this coastal Spanish culture that had its own Phoenician and slightly smaller perhaps Greek influence that then influenced the Celtic tribes that were on their fringe. And Barry Cunliffe has suggested that this creation of the Celtiberian culture led to them becoming the strongest of the polities within Spain, because they were able to link both the Mediterranean trade that the Iberians had access to through the Phoenicians and the Greeks, as well as the raw materials, the metals and the fighting prowess of the Celtic peoples to the north, and so acted as perfect middlemen in the middle of the two. An interesting point of note for the Celtiberians is that a large amount of their language has survived to us in various inscriptions for which they used the Iberian alphabet, and again shows how they were connected to their neighbours. What's interesting, however, from having looked at this is that while they were using this alphabet, the language that the Celtiberians wrote in was a Celtic language, and likely they were able to communicate with other tribes. And again, rather than seeing it as being either a Celt or a Celtiberian with these strong lines, it was probably a bit more of a spectrum, with those living closest to the Iberians taking on most of the Iberian culture, and those living further away only a few tenets. What's interesting though is that this language was completely different to the language being spoken by the Iberians. So while the Iberians would be able to see the script that they were writing and to read the characters, they would have no idea what the language said. And likewise, those Celts who could not read the Iberian script would be able to speak fluently with Celtiberians, but would not be able to read the actual writing that was there. The fighting prowess of the Celtiberians would be noted to the Romans even before they invaded. And during the Punic Wars, it's actually from them that they adopted the gladius hispaniensis, which was a certain type of double-edged sword that could be used both for stabbing and for thrusting, which the Romans learned all too well when they were fighting against the Carthaginians, for whom the Celtiberians were acting as mercenaries. Although again, more of this will be in the upcoming episode on the Roman conquest of Hispania. So far, we've talked about the Iberians who inhabited the area of the Spanish Levant that were actively sought out by merchants from across the sea, from Phoenicia, as well as from Greece and its various colonies in and throughout the Mediterranean. We've talked about the Celtic peoples who lived further to the north and the development of their Castro culture, as well as some points and problems about their origins. And finally, we mentioned the fact that there were a people that were neither 100% Celtic nor 100% Iberian, a kind of hybrid culture that developed between the two. But there are also some others we should mention, and one that I'm sure people will already be asking about since the intro of this video are the Basques. Oh, mysterious. It's often the case when a people have not much written down about their early history, and especially when a group of people speak a language isolate, that DNA can be particularly enlightening for where a people came from. And several DNA studies into the genetics of modern Basque people, as well as several skeletons from earlier periods, have shown that the Basque people were a mixture of the hunter-gatherer group of the Mesolithic, as well as the new farmers that came in during the Neolithic culture and had an agricultural sedentary way of life rather than the nomadic way of life of the hunter-gatherers. But what's different about the Basque DNA compared to others in the Iberian Peninsula is that they do not get the same kind of admixture from groups that are often associated with cultures like the incoming movement of Celtic peoples from the rest of Europe, or from those from North Africa like the Carthaginians, or those from the other parts of the Mediterranean like the Greeks and the Phoenicians. These are all found in the DNA of other peoples in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, but not in the Basque country, which suggests that the Basque country, as does its language, was largely isolated from other cultures. And from what we've seen by the position of the Ebro River, as well as the Basque position within the Pyrenees being by the mountains, it's quite possible that they were isolated for a long time. And also what may have played into this is a kind of chosen isolation, that they were a warrior people that did not want to be disturbed, because often migration brought trouble with it. Classical sources from the period describe a group called the Vascones, as well as the Aquitani, that were living on either side of the Pyrenees, both in what is now Spain and what is now France. And of the Aquitani people, there are some inscriptions that have been left over, which are believed to be a language that was related to Proto-Basque. Although Aquitani has now gone extinct, the Basque language is still spoken. Finally, there is also a question at what was happening at the opposite end of Spain. Bordering with what is now Portugal, there was an area that there is a bit of a mysterious material culture there. It has certain links to the Iberian material culture, but has very strong influences from the Phoenicians as well. And this area was called Tartessos. Now, it was said to be incredibly wealthy in luxury metals, these being especially the silver mines of the Rio Tinto region. And a lot has been written about Tartessos by ancient sources, and it was believed to be in this area around Gibraltar and slightly further north in the very western extremity of today's province of Andalusia. And some have even claimed that it was the final resting place of many of those who fled and escaped from Atlantis, and that is why it was such a rich city-state, that they brought the technology with them from there. And that's how we find it a lot of the time in the early modern period and on other medieval maps, this idea that those from Atlantis had come to Tartessos. But what we do know is that they were incredibly wealthy in minerals, and these are the first places where there were Phoenician colonies. So an important step in the history of Spain, but unfortunately not much else is known about them, apart from that they did indeed attract traders from across the Mediterranean to come and trade with them. But by the time of the 6th century, it had been subsumed into a wider Iberian culture. What is interesting is that there are some 95 inscriptions in the southwestern script, the name given to the script that was used to write the Tartessian language. And it's clear, if anyone has looked at cuneiform, for example, that many of these symbols are indeed derived from Phoenician letters. The oldest of these inscriptions dating from the 9th century BC, which shows just how long the Phoenicians had been involved on this coast, and explains why coastal peoples in Tartessos, as well as further to the north and the east, were adopting Phoenician ways of life, Phoenician gods and Phoenician art structures, rather than those that had been there beforehand. What is interesting as well is that the language represented there doesn't appear to be an Indo-European language, and so it potentially was related to the language of the Basques. And if it's correct that the language of the Basques was related to the language of the ancient Iberians further along the coast, then it might be interesting to speculate what these languages sounded like, the Paleo-Hispanic languages, before they were all subsumed by Latin. But without further information, that is a mystery that we cannot yet solve. I would just like to say a massive thank you to the City Council of Lugo. Yes, that is Lugo, that is named after one of the Celtic deities, which I will be making a video about in the future as well, because they have actually kindly sponsored this video and paid for my resources to look into this period of Iron Age Spanish history. And the reason why they are sponsoring today's video is because they run a reenactment festival that happens at the end of June every year. Now, with things opening up after what has been a very difficult time with the pandemic, hopefully some of you will be able to get down to Lugo, which is in Galicia, possibly the most Celtic region still around in Spain. It certainly feels like Scotland or Ireland when you're there, because this festival is on at the end of June every year, and they display how people lived in Spain during the Iron Age, showing not only the Roman side of things with the Roman invasion, which my forthcoming video will be looking at, but also some of the older peoples that lived there, like the Celts, the Celtiberians, and the Iberians. So it's really worth going out and checking that out. More information will be in the description below. Alright everyone, that will be it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into Spain in the Iron Age and all the various civilizations in all their colours and with all the mysteries attached that you might find in Spain and more broadly in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, I really hope you have enjoyed this one, as I've not covered that much Iron Age history. Having said that, I did do a series on the Picts about 4 years ago now, but it's a little bit out of date. So if you are interested in this kind of thing about the Celts as well, then do leave it in the comments below, because I can come back and look at some of these topics or specifics in more detail, as well as looking at the Carthaginian influence in Spain, which I think is particularly interesting. As I mentioned, this was sponsored by the Council of Lugo and the Arde Lucus, that's the Latin name for the city of Lugo, the reenactment festival there, and there will next month be a video on the Roman invasion of Iberia. But until then, many thanks for watching. A very hearty thanks to all the patrons who make it possible for me to spend hours researching this and buying books and bringing you content. And once again, thank you all for watching and engaging.